Hello, welcome to the archived presentation of how member attribution rosters unlock other use cases and improve efficiencies. This presentation was presented to the Da Vinci Project Trebuchet in January 2025. Project Trebuchet is part of the Da Vinci HL7 Fire Accelerator. This presentation is one provider's experience with implementing the Da Vinci Member Attribution Implementation Guide. The presenters provide insight into the business and technical aspects of preparing to implement and implementing the IG. This session is presented by Michael Westover, Vice President of Population Health at Providence, and Scott Rossignol, Partner at Farseen Advisors and Consultant for eHealth Exchange. Scott is also a co-lead of the Da Vinci Project Trebuchet. This session and all Da Vinci presentations are offered under the HL7 antitrust policy to ensure appropriate collaboration and information sharing.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited about this topic. My belief is that member attribution opens the door to so many of the important use cases that are meaningful to patients and to organizations when it comes to interoperability and value-based care and a host of other areas. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Scott Rossignol is also going to be co-presenting with me. We'll be going back and forth on the slides, but please, I can see there's some heavy hitters on this meeting that you're going to have questions. Please stop us and ask questions as we go through it. We'd love to make this as engaging as we can. Let's go a couple slides forward. We can go to the next one. All right, so first we want to set the stage for member rosters and ATR and why it matters so much. So I work for Providence, so a large health system on the West Coast. And Providence has over 150 value-based care risk arrangements. And for those risk arrangements, we receive member attribution rosters for 102 of those. So a huge number of member attribution rosters. And those rosters come in, we counted 68 individual data formats. I mean, they could be in Excel, they're CSV, like tab delimited files we receive. So it's ugly. There's a lot of data coming through. We also have we have 10 technology vendors that require consolidated member rosters, and they're in 10 proprietary formats. So we're not just ingesting member rosters. At our organization, we have to produce member rosters to then share with our external partners. We have one EMR that ingests our member rosters in its own proprietary format, and then those member rosters are used within our EHR. And also we have 3 payers that provide the data already in an ATR format, and that's going to be growing over time, and we're excited about our partners there. I wanted to give you an understanding of the complexity because you might be thinking, maybe you get the rosters and they're in slightly different formats, but they're pretty much the same, and that's really just not the case. We receive member rosters on the right. Here are just a few examples of how they're structured. We get data in a snapshot where you can see today who were members that are attributed to a risk arrangement. But it doesn't say anything about, a baby that was born 6 months ago, but we didn't find out about until, or the payer didn't find out about until yesterday. Or, so we have that snapshot. We have a different member roster for each year of eligibility. So during the course of the year, we'll get run out from the previous year in one file, and then we'll have a separate file with eligibility for the current year. We have attribution rosters where we get one record per eligibility span. So let's say if I were in a Medicaid contract and I were enrolled from January through March, but then I dropped off in April, and then I were enrolled from June through the end of the year, I would have 2 different records with beginning and end dates. We get member attribution rosters where we get multiple columns, so 1 column per month of attribution. And you can see, like, for January I'm enrolled, for February I'm not enrolled, for March I'm enrolled, and you kind of get ones and zeros or numbers that identify whether or not I'm attributed during that or eligible during that time period for the risk arrangement. And we get 1 record per member per month. So if I'm enrolled for 12 months, I'll have 12 records. And that can be on a rolling basis, or I can get 1 record per member per month going back to the beginning to the beginning of a contract period, and the file just gets bigger and bigger over time. And you can see how each of these different file structures, you're not just receiving this file structure once, you're receiving it like every week or every month or every quarter, and you have to piece these member rosters together. And if you add up all the complexity of these 68 different formats you receive, other types of member rosters that I'm not even listing here, you can see how it is a mess and something that we very much need to solve. And it can make our lives easier, our vendors' lives easier, our payer partners' lives easier. And this is a big deal for making healthcare better. All right. So now let's talk about member attribution lists. So member attribution lists contain the information about people attributed to payer partner contracts in a bulk file format. So think of it as a list of members and information about those members that you would need that's important for you to manage that population effectively. So ATR, I've created two large buckets here. One is ATR provides an understanding of really patient or member or person belonging. And then the other is it's a foundation for other use cases. So it's really the starting point, kind of unlocks or it opens the door. It allows you to do a lot of other exciting things with interoperability. They're important to the organization. So first on the patient belonging side or person belonging, it tells you which value-based care contracts a person belongs to, or it could be other types of belonging. So it could be a chronic disease cohorts. I mean, you could really, it's a way to create lists of members that you can do things with. It provides information about which providers or care team each member is attributed or assigned to. It provides an understanding of which organization each person is associated with. So these are all the things of belonging, right? Who does this member belong to? It also contains information about patient coverage at enrollment periods, or you could talk about it as attribution periods. When is this member attributed to a risk contract? The beginning, and when is this member not attributed to a risk contract, which is vital if you want to do anything with the patient population. And then it contains very important member demographic information in a more structured format than we receive through the previous versions of the free-for-all of data coming through CSV formats and Excel spreadsheets. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, where it creates a foundation is after you have this information in ATR format, you can match it with information in your EHR. You can combine it with other information that you're getting from other vendors, and it allows you to basically turn on that functionality with the vendor or in the EHR, or be able to slice and dice, the information in the EHR because that information is there. It's also the foundation for, let's say if you want to exchange clinical data to support clinical quality measurements, like quality improvements, first you need to start with which population are we working with here? Or if you want to get, you want to exchange claims data, or if you want to exchange any type of information in bulk for a population, ATR is where you would start. I think there are a lot of very important use cases that are about an individual at a point in time, but there are extremely important use cases that we're talking about a bulk block of patients, and ATR is the starting point for all of those. A few of those I have listed here, but there are a host of other ones that you could think of too. I'm pausing in case anybody has any questions. So ATR answers the most important question when it comes to value-based care for providers, and honestly for payers too. And that question is, who are the people we are caring for? And I know sometimes we want to jump to the care management and kind of fancy tools and risk adjustment and analytics and chronic disease cohort things, but you really need to start with who are the patients. And ATR can help us solve that problem. So it also will help payers and providers align and collaborate at scale. And here are a few ways that it can help us do that. So the first one is if I'm working with a trusted payer where we have we have all the documentation in place, and there's some of them I could see some representatives on the phone today. If I receive an ATR list from those payers and we have a risk contract in place, I can confidently exchange data and complete a task for that population. So because I know these are the lives, like there's no ambiguity around it. It's very clear. It also aligns payers and providers. So the insurance companies that we're working with, on the patient provider attribution. So there's no question about like which members belong to a risk arrangement or which provider is responsible or which care team is responsible for taking care of the member. If we have this ATR list where we have some back and forth around which member belongs to which provider and belongs to which risk arrangement. And it also allows our vendor partners to innovate. So here's an example of, I know EHR vendors are working on ways to ingest HR files in place of proprietary formats, so that they can get the data in one way, in a standardized way, much more quickly without as much work and back and forth. And so that they can focus on creating great products instead of focusing on fighting with the data. And this is not a small thing. When we work with vendors, when it comes to sharing attribution lists with them now, it can take 6 months or a year for us to start using their products because we're fighting with the data. And if it can come in a standard format like ATR that everybody agrees on, we can get up to speed much, much faster. And here's an example of, on the right-hand side, about how ATR can make a big impact in a way you might not expect. So, and this is from Multicare. So Multicare was receiving data from a payer partner, and their match rate was between 75 and 85%, matching the data from the payer with their EMR because the data was coming in non-standard formats. But after they shifted to ATR, they were able to get their match rate up to 98 to 99%. And that was, I mean, in large part because the payer data was more consistent. So it's in that ATR data format. There's more information provided in ATR than what was coming in the previous iteration. And so they were able to successfully match that data with Epic or with their EHR because they were using a standard format. And this is a big deal. I mean, we have armies of people that all they do is look up information from the payer side about a member, and then they compare that with the clinical information coming from so the EMR data, comparing it with the payer data to try to find a solid match and see if this actually is the Michael Westover that we're talking about. It is very expensive. It takes a lot of time. And honestly, if we get it wrong, it hurts patient care. And I mean, this is a life-saving measure, in my opinion. If the data is not matched appropriately, that means that someone either is not getting the care that they may need, or they are receiving care that they don't need. So if you overmatch, meaning you're combining two Michael Westovers that aren't the same Michael, or you're creating two separate records for one Michael Westover, really that's going to hurt patient care. So efficiency, patient care, lives, I mean, ATR, I think, covers a little bit of everything here. And I think I saw there's a question I'm going to look at real fast. Amal from NCQI. Hi, Amal. At some point, I'd love to hear about EHRs may support ATR IG out of the box for managing group functionality within their regulated bulk API. I think this is an excellent question. I think there are some folks from EHRs that are well positioned to talk about the innovations that they're working on. But yes, I know that some of the EMRs are working on that. And it's something that we're frankly advocating for heavily because we'd love to just take the HR data and send it to them natively without making any transformations, into their applications. And so I know that's something we've asked for. I know it's something that they're working on.
Right. I think just to clarify, though, we're not seeing EHR support the ingestion of ATR formatted rosters, so FHIR data for ATR purposes. And we're not seeing EHRs support the extraction of ATR data yet today. I think the extraction concept, to Amal's point, could be built upon bulk FHIR pretty easily. I am not clear on if there are specific resource types that are not supported, or if there are some nuances to ATR that would require some enhancement to get bulk data standard up to speed. I think overall, though, the ingestion process is much more important from the EHR perspective, right, Michael?
Yes, from the EHR's perspective, the ingestion process is more important. We're also advocating strongly for being able to get our patient lists out of the EHR. So yes, I say more important on the ingestion, but important on both sides.
So an interesting thing, and maybe this is something that we could explore, is that Epic's groups are generated almost in the same way that roster management engine works. So Epic actually generates, in a way, a group for fire purposes that should match a roster that's ingested by, for Cambia or from another payer. So I think, we might actually be able to explore this using current functionalities to understand if that extraction works or if there are changes that are required. I'm not sure if we've ever looked at, does the bulk data standard comply exactly with how ATR is intending to extract these lists?
Good point.
Thanks, go ahead.
Okay, great question. All right, so ATR from my perspective can absolutely make providers' lives easier, and not just the providers' lives, but the vendors and partners that we work with. So switching from a delimited flat file or spreadsheet to ATR, like here's some ways that it can make life easier. So one way is it reduces the ingestion burden. Instead of dealing with one format, or you deal with one format instead of a innumerable number of formats, like the 68 formats. That is painful. Also, ATR is less brittle than the other versions that we're working with, meaning you have one version controlled roster instead of unexpected format changes. And what happens commonly now is the data formats can change from year to year, and they'll just change. There's a new column in there, there's a new data structure, and you're not expecting it. And that is less than ideal and causes delays. Negotiations between payers and providers can be easier, meaning you don't have data standoffs between payers and providers about which proprietary formats to use. That's something that we've seen the benefit of when we talk about ATR. It's hard to say when we say, why don't we use a national standard that provides everything we need and will help with patient matching? It's hard to push against that and say, no, I want to use my proprietary standard. It can reduce data lags, meaning so the attribution information is more valuable the more real time it is, meaning the more out of date it is, the less useful it is. So if we can reduce the data lag by having data standards and being able to load that data as quickly as possible into our EHRs and other vendor applications, the information will be more timely, our providers will be happier, our patients will be able to see the benefits of the data. And then the last thing is that it sets a nice foundation for growth. So it gives you a scalable data foundation on which to expand data value-based care. When I talk to other health systems, I think there's one of the reasons why value-based care doesn't expand is because the data flow back and forth is just so onerous. If we can get standardized data like FHIR, be able to flow back and forth between these organizations, we can think more about how do we create contracts that work, and how can we partner together between payers and providers instead of how do we fight over the data back and forth. Any questions or comments about this? Should we go to the next slide? So here's some groups that are testing or in production with ATR. I'm sure there are other ones but these are those that are listed on the Confluence site, Da Vinci's Confluence site. On here, you can see that there are large provider groups that can see the value of this. There are payers, large payers that are exploring this. And honestly, some of these are already in production. We have Cerner as an EHR on this list. So we have vendors that can see the value, large providers. It just feels like there's some momentum around this. And I feel like those who understand it, like immediately see the value and would like to use it, especially if they have willing partners. And I would love to, I talked about how we have 68 data formats now, and one of those is FHIR. We would love to have 10 data formats and one of those be FHIR, and then make that 5 and then 3 and then 2. I know this is going to be a multi-year process to get there, but we want to move as quickly as we can to just have more and more FHIR and less other. No,
Great.
time over to Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here and just talk a little bit about the data flow for ATR and how this process works. This So this process includes essentially 3 steps. There's not a ban step where the organizations that are participating enter into an agreement to trade data. And this is really an important step from an implementer's perspective, be it a provider or a payer. If you want to move your organization in the direction of using ATR, this is where you have to start, the agreement that's in place between your organizations. Because if you have an agreement that specifies that the ATR standard will be used, to Michael's point, it's hard to argue against that. It's a national standard that everyone can adopt and leverage and save a lot of time in the long run. So if you're looking at a place, where do I start? Figure out who's performing these contract negotiations with your organization and get this information in front of them and help them understand why ATR is a valuable standard to adopt, because that's the first step in getting this working. The next 2 steps are really about getting the data and making sure it's accurate. So the initial step is to generate a member attribution list. This should come from the payer, the producer. That member attribution list in step 3 is then vetted by the provider or by the consumer. The vetting process inside of the implementation guide allows for the additional or removal or confirmation of a list via API. So there are actually electronic ways to do this. If you're a technology vendor out there and you want to support ATR, this is a really nice value add, where you could actually help a provider or payer organization manage the list and attribution processes by supporting these APIs and sort of enabling list maintenance. Finally, once a list is approved, then that list is downloaded and utilized or exported, really, and then imported into the consumer system. So really, this is a very basic data flow. It uses the FHIR standard. It really is just about trading this list and the relevant components of the list and making sure they're accurate. Any questions before we proceed? Yeah, that's a good question. Can the list ever be final, really? Yes, the list is going to be accurate as of a current date time. That list is going to change over time, but a list can be, final for today, right? I can say that today, yes, this is accurate, with the knowledge that it will change over time. I think what I don't understand is, are there certain periods of time where that list should be reviewed, or does it have to be really reviewed every day or on an ongoing basis? I don't think that an everyday or even like a very regular review is necessary here. I would default to what organizations are doing today in terms of their list review. And, Michael, do you have anything? Can you weigh in there? How is Providence really performing that process today?
Yeah, so generally the way it works, and I can speak for Providence, but I know it's generally this how it happens. This isn't the case everywhere, but almost in our experience, the payer is the arbiter of which members belong to a risk population. So they're the ones that make that call. And so they provide the list to us, and we can provide feedback on that list and why a member shouldn't be there, but they're the ones ultimately who decide who's on our list. And so it's right the moment we receive it.
Okay, so yeah, you're not really doing a review today.
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, so I think there's opportunity here, really, right? Like, how do you do a review of this list if you're not doing that today? Is there data in the EHR that can inform this? I think we'll actually talk a little bit about some of that. And to Kevin's point in the chat, asking about the list being static for the period of an agreement, I think that's also an important consideration. If you're consuming 70 lists, which lists expire on what dates, what agreements expire when? So tracking and managing that seems like another area where maybe the implementation guide itself doesn't specify this, but implementers can help each other understand how they're performing these processes and what really makes sense for them, in order to reduce burden and not have everybody have to reinvent the wheel now that they have this data standard and some of these capabilities that didn't exist before.
Yeah, and part of that is there's generally a contract in place that determines, for what time period. Is this a prospective attribution where we're defining the population at the beginning of the year? Is this it can change throughout the course of the year based on the member's behavior about which location a provider goes to? Is it those who choose a specific insurance? Maybe it's on some kind of exchange that are automatically a part of this network until they come off. So all of that is defined in the terms of the arrangement. And the attribution time period, like when it begins and when it ends, is defined within ATR. So there's absolutely a way to manage this using a combination of the contracting and the HR data. The most recent HR data tends to trump the previous HR data too for retroactive changes in attribution.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity here to rectify the EHR against the attribution list as well, right? If I get coverage for a patient today and that patient's attributed to a totally different payer, what do I do? How do we flag that and manage that update process if it is, if data is factually kind of contradictory between sources?
That's a big topic. Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next slide. So thinking about when to use ATR is, of course, critical in the deployment of ATR. So the question that we hear a lot is like, what is the source of truth when it comes to rosters, and why can't the EHR be the source of truth? The EHR has patients. Those patients have eligibility and benefits queries that are returned and provide information. And I think the answer is that it's more complicated than that. It's not just about coverage, and it's not just about the specific coverage a patient presented with at a given visit. So, the first comment here is that insurance coverage is different from attribution. Right. So while they might be the same in some circumstances, they are not always. The contracts will dictate how rosters are formed versus how coverage is defined. And I think it's fair to say that these are not a one-to-one relationship. I think there are other concerns. Go ahead, Michael. Did you have anything there?
No, I just wanted to agree with you. Absolutely. Very, very often, we have a multiple risk arrangements within a single insurer and sub risk arrangements where you would want to define them through a separate ATR list.
Great. So that's another topic that maybe needs to be addressed is how do you actually, if there are sub arrangements, what is the relationship between rosters that a payer provides? Is there a relationship or should there be? Potentially there's the concept of a sub list or, a portion of a list becoming its own list. So I think there's additional questions there too. Okay, so the two next topics, the second and third bullet points here are really about EHR data itself. I think most folks on the call probably understand that EHR data is only as up to date as its users make it, right? So a user has to enter that information. So it could either be that, the patient hasn't been in and the user hasn't updated that patient's coverage in a while, or that the patient's coverage data is out of date for other reasons. So really, I think coverage is a useful tool for certain purposes, but it's not going to help you identify exact patient roster lists. Michael, I had one question for you around the additional resources that ATR provides. Right, so ATR is a FHIR standard, and it's going to provide information like the entire patient resource. It's going to provide information like the associated provider for risk arrangements and potentially organization. Is that what we're referring to there as some additional resources, or are there other things we want to call out?
And exactly. I mean, I think the most important is there's that big difference between insurance and attribution. This will tell you who you're attributed to, which risk arrangement. I mean, I'd say that's the big one.
Right. Yeah, I know a lot of provider organizations are spending time assigning PCPs for risk-based arrangements, right? So there are some provider organizations out there where a patient has 2 or 4 PCPs because of the way that that patient's insurance is defined and the risk arrangements that are associated. This happens. So it feels like member attribution rosters could actually be used to dictate one of a patient's PCPs.
Yep.
So that's another sort of manual process that's occurring in the EHR today, where really we might be able to, with some maturity, actually automate that using this process.
Yeah. And I think you bring up there's that back and forth. There's the payer's perspective of who a member belongs to from a PCP, and then there's the provider's perspective. And I think ATR provides a framework for there to be feedback on these types of things. Um, that I think is very, very exciting. Right now, a lot of what happens is we say, here's the payer view, here's the provider view. They don't match. They're both important.
Okay, that final bullet point there is really around a shared understanding, and I think that this is what we've been talking about a lot, is that there's a difference in understanding between the provider and payer, and that difference can persist over time. And um, really what ATR does is it allows the organizations to get together and agree. Now, this isn't necessary for the standard to work. You know, the payer could continue to dictate that X, Y, and Z patients are part of this roster and not allow for providers to make those changes. And it feels like that's current state today from what I'm hearing. Um, so I think that's part of the contracting and discussion process, right? I think providers need to be armed with information that they can and should be able to manage that list, and they should be able to use the ATR implementation guide as the mechanism to do that. Michael, do you think that that's the right approach, that providers should be thinking about list management and ownership, and whether they actually want to be able to influence those lists and work with payers to come to an agreement on that?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that everybody agrees would be fantastic if there were an easy way for payers and providers to have conversations around actually this member doesn't belong to me, it belongs to someone else. I think do we have the tools in place to do that yet? But I'm hoping this is the direction that the industry goes. I honestly don't feel like we're there from a technology perspective yet, but we have the framework with ATR.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please.
Oh, now we're getting into the good stuff. So now we'd love to share with you some of the things that we've learned while we've been working with ATR. So we're in production with a few payers, and just here's some things that we've learned in those conversations with them. And we've had honestly many conversations with many different payers across the country with this, and many providers. So when it comes to ATR, there are 2 groups. One is the group that's producing ATR or that's sharing ATR, and then there's a group that's ingesting ATR. I mean, typically the group producing ATR is a payer and the group ingesting is a provider, but that doesn't always need to be the place, right? The case. There could be vendors, other kind of intermediaries or other use cases we're not considering. Um, I'm very grateful to the payer partners that have worked on this with us, because when it comes to creating ATR, a lot of the work is on the payer side, frankly, and the providers get to benefit from that data coming in a standardized format. So the providers get to benefit. So for those that are sharing the member rosters, here are a few things that we've found to be helpful, and that we've heard from our payer partners. One is it's useful to take a look at the data that you're already providing to your provider partners, and look at the fields that are there, so the resources that are there, and compare that with ATR. It's likely that a large percentage of the fields that you need to share through ATR are already embedded in the member rosters that are in non-ATR formats. And if you see the differences that are there, maybe there are a few required fields that you didn't think you needed, but are required for ATR, you can look at what would it take to get those fields into our files. And maybe everything is there. I mean, you can think if you're very far along, um, you're close to being able to produce that type of file. Also, I think it's helpful to ask whether upstream systems can deliver rosters to you. Like, is there any way you can get the data that you need to produce ATR in a Fire native format? And if not, can you push those vendors, those upstream partners to produce the data in an ATR format that you can use? Also, evaluate the pathways to transform the current ATR data and expose modern APIs. We've spoken to some pair partners that have said, like, we can't do ATR because first we're going to have to go to the cloud. We're going to have to re-architect our entire infrastructure, and that's going to take us years and millions of dollars. And I honestly just, my understanding is that's not the case. Other payers have partnered with a vendor that's been able to take their working infrastructure and produce Fire in a way that can get them very started while they're working on creating their giant infrastructure in the back end? Or are there ways that they can take their existing flat file format, think .csv, .txt, delimited flat files, and turn that into ATR because the data is already there in a way that can work very well for your provider partners and other groups you might be working with. So the next one is find a provider partner and or vendor to work with. The Da Vinci Trebuchet meetings, I mean, we're in a Trebuchet meeting right now, is an excellent place to find a partner to work on. I know we've spent a lot of time collaborating with our partners in these meetings. And then the last one is seek reciprocity. So if you're going through the work of creating this ATR data that the provider can benefit from and the provider's vendors can benefit from, you should ask, like, now that I'm giving you ATR, is there a way that we could receive data that we need in a Fire format as well? Like, can you participate in a national network, or can you give us the clinical or administrative data that we need to be successful in return? And I'm sure there are other things we could talk about here. I'd love to talk to you more about it, but here's some just quick things that we've learned. Now on the provider side, so the groups that are ingesting the member rosters, also look at the gaps between the member rosters you receive in ATR. And then you can provide feedback to your provider. Like, hey, we're already receiving 99% of the data, the data fields. Why don't we just move to ATR, modern APIs? We can do this in a better way than maybe than what we've been doing before. Review which tools utilize member rosters and validate their readiness for Fire ingestion. So look at your EHR. Is your EHR ready to capture the HR data that you have? That would be nice. Certainly advocate with them. The vendors that you're using, maybe you have a value-based care analytic vendor that you're working with. Maybe you're working with a notification vendor. I mean, there's this list of vendors that we work with, and we're talking to each of them about, like, can you accept the HR data from us? Either the HR data that we've aggregated or the data directly from our payer partners without us aggregating it or doing anything with it. So take a look at it. It'll help with deciding where you want to have those conversations. And honestly, it'll help you evaluate which vendors you want to sign up with in the future. Like, if they cannot move to more modern tools, it should be a factor in your decision process. I think it's also important to consider whether you would like to have ATR data from end to end in your infrastructure, or if you want to flatten it out at some point. I know we use some tools internally that cannot accept ATR data, and so we have to take ATR data, flatten it, and then transform it before we can send it through, like our groupers, for example, that are will group our claims data. So take a look at that. Like, do you want HR to be or Fire to be the foundation for your infrastructure? It's a great question. Also find a payer. You'll need to find someone to partner with, a payer that's willing to send you data in that format so you can experiment with it. And then also offer to reciprocate. If a payer is willing to go through the trouble of creating HR data for you, are there things that you can provide to that payer that would benefit them in return? Ideally, this is a reciprocal, balanced relationship where we're both getting information and giving information that we need to take care of our patient populations together and meaningfully manage the business. Well, I see a question about, is the ATR format consistent with TEFCA standard format for requests and responses through the QHINs? I see we have some
question.
Yeah.
No. The format of the data itself is no problem, right? We're talking about Fire data here, but TEFCA does not have a predefined SOP for bulk data. So there are ways to do this within TEFCA. So don't get me wrong here. I don't think that you should just say, absolutely, I can't do this over TEFCA. Oh, this is broken. That's not the case. TEFCA is actually pretty loose in some ways, but there's no SOP specific to this use case in TEFCA, and there's no underlying like TEFCA framework that deals with bulk data that's well defined. So if you are on TEFCA and you want to trade ATR data, the best way to do so is by agreement between the parties that are trading, and that agreement's required anyway, right? So because you're already talking between the provider and payer that you want to trade fire data via ATR, you're more than welcome if you both have TEFCA certificates. If you're both part of TEFCA, you're welcome to use those to connect and to trade data. That follows a kind of carve-out pathway within TEFCA, which essentially allows participants to communicate with each other using whatever file formats and standards they would like, as long as there's an agreement in place. That carve-out doesn't exist long-term. It's there right now and available. So there's probably more to do here within TEFCA, and generally, I'm one of the people working with folks at TEFCA to help them understand what Da Vinci is doing and how we need TEFCA to flex to enable Da Vinci standards. This one is a good call out.
Yeah. I agree that it's an excellent discussion point. There's something about the nature of these attribution files where I'm not just TEFCA, but when it comes to national exchange networks that are really the pipes for data exchange, where you want to take clinical data or claims data and move it from one place to another. I feel like the ATR data or the member attribution roster is something that needs to persist, meaning you can decide like, can I share data for this population? So I think it's an important part of the conversation around national data exchange that we need to keep talking about. Any other questions on this? Next slide. Okay, challenges when working with ATR. And I'm speaking from Providence's experience on this. Some of the things we've run into that we just might let you know are coming if you're going to be working with ATR. So one is inertia. We have some pairs that that say things like, we've been sharing this attribution file for the last 10 years. When we have so many groups that are like hooked into this old, like ugly flat file format, it's going to be difficult for us to just switch completely over to ATR, or over to a national standard. And I totally get that. I think we have the partners that we're working with, they've said, why don't we share with you, in parallel ATR, and we'll kind of experiment with it. And then you can choose whether to take the old format or the new format. More folks will kind of move over to ATR as they see the benefit of it. Also, the data exchange when it comes to member rosters in the past has been very like column and row driven. So like think a data table or Excel-based view, where you can see there's like one record per member per month. And because ATR and really Fire in general is in an ND-JSON format, it just takes groups a little while to wrap their minds around something. It's not a lot for a technical person, but for folks that are used to that kind of columnar data set, it can be an adjustment for them. And folks just might not be used to it in your organization. Data validation is a big deal. It's very important that when we receive data validation, there's another slide coming up like this, but then you validate that it actually complies with, is Fire compliant, the data is compliant with the spec. And that hasn't always been the case. So we've had a lot where we'll receive data, it's not exactly right, and then we'll have to iterate. The next one is, this is to the comment, like, what do you mean there are additional fields? Like I delivered all the required ones. This is the conversation we've had before. Certainly ATR, the required spec, the required fields, or the required resources can work for data exchange and for value-based care. But there are some fields that might be helpful to move you along the way. Like I'll give you an example for Providence. Providence is a massive organization that crosses multiple states. If we have contracts that are across multiple states, it's very helpful for us if we include the tax ID, which gives us a sense for which part the tax ID for an individual patient, like their primary tax ID or the tax ID of the provider that's responsible for the patient or the care team. And that helps us very much decide which part of Providence that we're talking about here. It's not a required field, but it is something that is very helpful. So working with payers to help add extensions where they're required can be a conversation that is useful. It is certainly, I want to make it very clear that it is not required to make value-based care work, or no extension is absolutely necessary for value-based care to function. But this could be a situation where it could benefit both parts of the payer and the provider if there were an extension added to help. This is one of those 80-20 rule thing, right? We don't want to, we want the tool to be flexible enough so that it meets 90% of the situations, but in that 10%, there could be an extension that could be helpful. Security review. So if you're exchanging ATR via hosted APIs, this is PHI. So it's also so it's patient health information, it's patient identifiable information. So it's one of those things that if you're sharing data via these APIs, the security review can take time. And I know in our system, whenever we start talking about patients, we want to make sure that we're very careful about protecting our patients' data when working with ATR. So a lot of working with the information security teams and getting feedback and specs and back and forth on that took a while. This is probably the thing that took the longest when it came to working with ATR on our side and being able to, and FHIR in general, anything on the API side. And then lagging partners. Some internal systems may still require flat files, so meaning we'll have ATR that needs to be flattened. And this is one area where we're working with our critical vendors to say like, hey, we want to continue to partner with you in the long run. But in order to continue to partner, we want you to come along with the technology, use more industry standards instead of your proprietary standards. It'll make the data more accurate. We'll be able to move faster. Like we need to move in this direction together. Any questions? Nope. Okay, next slide.
All right. So I think when it comes to validating data, there are 3 ways to think about how you want to do your data validation. First is comparing historical counts. And what I would like to summarize this as is to say, am I seeing the right number of patients? Second is to compare individual details. Is the patient data accurate and complete? Finally, adherence to spec. Can I load and use the data? So these are very common steps that you would perform with a lot of different data ingestions. And it doesn't really change with attribution. Something to consider as you're going live with attribution or starting is what metrics do you have today or can you capture from your current data to support this comparison work? What validation work do you want to do on your current state or review of your current state to make sure that future state you have the detail needed to perform that validation quickly?
Yeah, and a couple quick comments on this. This is one area that it sounds so obvious, but in most cases when we've been working with ATR, the data comes in and the population is either much, much larger or much, much smaller than we were receiving through the previous version. Maybe there was a subpopulation that wasn't included, or there was an additional population that came in accidentally. And so this, at the highest level, those historical counts have been very, very important. And then looking at the individual details, we've run into issues there. And adherence to spec, we've had some back and forth where someone, group says, hey, we have the data, here's the spec, here you go. And then we'll bounce it up against our FHIR server and it doesn't. So very important to go through these.
Yeah, I mean, anybody that's worked with data knows that you're going to get a bunch of garbage to start and you're going to have to work together to figure it out. But once you do it right for the once, then it's going to work after that, right? It's going to work for that roster. It's going to work for all rosters. So the work to generate those rosters is, time consuming. The work to ingest them the first time is time consuming. Just like any other data ingestion process that you'd take on. But in this case, you have portability and scale. So it makes a lot more sense than doing that with a one-off extract. Okay, next slide, please. Right. So I think what we've talked a little bit about is that bidirectionality of exchange and how providers can provide feedback. We do see that as the future of happy data exchange or healthy data exchange. Reciprocity is extremely important for all data exchange. Having reciprocal data exchange, the ability for both sides to get the information they need from each other, is the best way to create and build trust between organizations, and helps increase collaboration because you are communicating. So I believe it was the second release of this guide. I don't know if it was 1.0 or a second, I could check, but that introduced this feedback mechanism, which allows the consuming organization to provide feedback on the roster, indicate an add or a remove or acceptance of the roster via API. We don't think anybody's actually taken advantage of this yet. I think we've called out a few operational reasons that we think this could be challenging or could take some time for organizations to actually start practicing. I think the proof will be in the pudding as far as whether or not this actually adds enough value that it's worth the effort being put in, or if payers and providers simply want to have a unidirectional exchange.
Yeah. Just to shine a light, I was thinking about as Scott was talking. Right now, our feedback loop is where things don't make sense. Someone emails my team, and then we email the payer with a list, in an email saying this member doesn't belong to us for this reason. And then the payer says, I'm sorry, I can't do anything with this list, the way it stands. So I feel like if there is a partnership that is willing to tackle this, this is something that is a big deal to caregivers on the front lines. It annoys providers, like physicians on the front lines, when a payer says this patient belongs to you, and you know for a fact that the patient belongs to someone else. It's something that people on the front lines do not like at all. So I hope that someone picks this up and goes after it. I think it could really help the ability of payers and providers to collaborate. And, I'd love for someone to take this on.
Okay, I think our last slide is just a quick review of the member attribution snapshot, the IG snapshot from Da Vinci. I think it's important to note here that bullet point at the bottom that this is aligned with the CMS, DPC, and BCDA programs. So that's great. If you're participating in those programs, you might already have a leg up here, or vice versa. If you're seeking to roll this out, it might be a great reason to start using those rosters with DPC and BCDA. And I think, the looking ahead is also kind of interesting, where we've hit a point where this functionally makes sense. The IG is getting adopted, it's being used in production, and now the question is really how do we evolve this IG and make it more concrete and part of other processes? So moving some of these concepts into HREX for more as a foundational support makes sense to me, as well as helping organizations get up and running with this in production, which is one of our goals here today. Michael, do you have any final thoughts or anything else? We are almost at time here.
No, I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us. And if anybody would like to chat about ATR or pair provider stuff, I know that the my experiences at the Trebuchet group has been many folks, including Scott. I'm very much willing. Mike Gould, other folks. If anybody has any questions, please reach out to us either in the official meetings or outside, and we'd love to help you get going.